moving on onto your own references and influences when creating, and as well, what advice would you give a student? We would like to know, on the one hand, what influences do you have to create all these complex characters and all these lives, and on the other hand, what advice would you give a student who wants to work as a game writer, or wants to work in creating stories for games?
I think the one thing that I guess I have diverged slightly from is oftentimes we like to tell ourselves or tell people that video game narrative is so unique that it's an entirely different way of telling a story to all the classical ways of telling a story, so that we don't necessarily need all that knowledge. Whereas I very much see it as, and certainly the games I've been making are doing the same things and using the same parts of the brain that a traditional story should. So understanding and deconstructing and kind of understanding the tools of traditional storytelling is super useful. And for me, like I mentioned Hitchcock's The Birds, but like looking at someone like Hitchcock was very interesting to me, because he is a director who was focused on the relationship between the film and its audience. The story of a Hitchcock movie is not the plot, it's not the words the characters say, it's the things the audience is thinking, right? So his whole toolkit for suspense was to suggest something to the audience, and then it's in your imagination, you're anticipating it, you're expecting or wanting something to happen. And then when that's frustrated or twisted in some way, that creates a lot of the energy of the narrative. So it's very easy to look at the way that Hitchcock made his movies and relate that to video games, especially like having this interest that I have, which is very much thinking about what is the game trying to make the audience do? What is the game trying to make the audience want? How is that kind of driving things? So understanding that that's how all stories are told, that those things absolutely still apply, I think is super instructive. When it comes to creating the narratives, as I said, like with her story, for me, the idea of going out there and researching things and absorbing stuff is never fails to not be super relevant. And I think particularly it's so easy now to spend 5 hours looking on the internet and feel like I've researched that topic, but like reading books on stuff, like books still are just such a ridiculous amount and detail of knowledge and way of expressing things. So whatever I'm doing, I will make sure I've gone and read 2 or 3 books on a subject. And the process of doing that, you just have so many specific little details and interesting things. And if you do enough of that, you will have got past the obvious things. I think that's like the biggest sin of video games, maybe other media as well, because of the business constraints, because of the creative constraints. Oftentimes, if you get 10 people in a room and get them to brainstorm something, at some point, someone will say an idea that everyone loves. And everyone loves it because it's an idea that everybody saw in a movie last year, or was in a TV show, and so it's near the top of their brain, and they recognize it and they remember it being cool, so it feels like a cool idea, and then that gets that's something that the vice president of whatever video game publisher gets, because they're like, oh, I understand that this is a cool thing because I also saw and experienced this thing. But by the time your game comes out, there are 10 other games riffing on that same thing. It's now old, it's tired, it will never be as cool as it was in the thing that inspired you. Whereas if you really dig into a subject and read up on it, you will find the weirder, more specific, more interesting, more detailed little beats that then allow you to create something that actually feels fresh and interesting and true. And just I find looking at different POVs is always rewarding. So I think the one that was exciting for me on her story was I remember reading, I can't quite remember the name of it, but it was an academic piece on the role of laughter in police interviews, both as a tool for the detective, but also what does it mean when a suspect laughs? And I remember this particular piece, because it was an academic text, starts out by creating an apparatus for discussing conversations and how we might, break a conversation down into its constituent parts. And it introduced, in the case of a police interview, the idea that you have three participants. There is the detective, who is asking the questions to reveal guilt. There is the suspect, who is attempting to not incriminate themselves, whether or not they're guilty. But there is also the third participant. I can't remember, maybe they're called the invisible participant or something. And when a conversation is occurring, the two people in the room are actually speaking to the third participant. The third participant would be if this conversation is recorded and played to a jury at a later date, right? Or is written down in evidence. That's the third participant. So if a detective says, "Where were you on September the 3rd?" The suspect, who is aware that this is going to be used against them later, might rephrase the question at the start by saying, "Where was I on the 3rd?" Because they want to make sure that if this is played, it can't be chopped up and recontextualized. And everything that is being said, the way that the detective asks a question, again, he's phrasing it so that when this is played at trial, his question will in itself contain the answer or whatever. And I remember reading this thing and being like, oh my God, this third participant, that's the player. Like, they are this invisible character that is in the room that everything is aimed at, who is not actually themselves contributing to the conversation, but is like the whole reason for this conversation existing. And that really kind of in my head unlocked just like a real understanding of the mechanisms in this room, why it felt interesting to me to watch people in a police interview, because even though it wasn't for my benefit, actually it really was for my benefit. And that gave me a great insight into like, why is this interesting as a game mechanic? Why would the player care about this? And, that came from me going, what academic texts are there to read about police interviews? This one sounds fun. I'll read this. So I think, reading broadly, looking at different disciplines can really help you unlock, because, not to get pretentious, but like, the essence of making a video game is really understanding human behavior. Like, you have a human being sat there plugged into a machine, and you're trying to delight their brains, and they have to participate, and there has to be this shared understanding and this shared language. So, you can read pretty broadly about all sorts of things, and it will become relevant. Super, fantastic. So one last thing to close everything up a bit. And this is a bit of a stretch, but how do you see the future of narrative in video games? How do you see things going in the future, and where would you like things to go? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to look back and when I talk about things like Silent Hill, like in 2000, so 2007, I guess, we were working on Origins. Back then, and like when we got to make Shattered Memories, Silent Hill was like the only video game IP that allowed us to care about a character with an inner life, to have a story that took place in the modern world, without any kind of superhero embellishment, because otherwise you just weren't able to explore those kinds of stories and characters. If I'd pitched Shattered Memories, if I'd said, I want to make this game that's about the complicated grief of this 18-year-old girl, people would go, nah, that doesn't sound that interesting as a video game. But because it was Silent Hill, we got away with it. But now, 13 years on, the breadth is much greater. I think, digital transformed things, because when we went to digital, you're no longer pitching the sales manager of GameStop. It used to be whatever game you made, if it had to be sold in a store, it had to be ordered and bought by the regional sales manager of the video game shop. And, so you were not pitching your player. You're not saying, I think this is an interesting game. You're having to say, look, I think this is a cool game, and you're going to want to put it on the shelves of your store. Because if they didn't think that, no one could buy your game. As soon as we went to digital, you could be much more specific and niche. So there's no way any publisher or GameStop sales manager would have bought into her story before it came out. But I was confident that there will be enough people in the world plugged into the internet who would be interested in this thing. So I think that's been a big kind of transformation. I think the ubiquity of technology, her story being on iPhone was important. Everybody has a phone, even if they don't have a games console. A lot of people now will have a games console or a laptop or a smart TV that can possibly play these things. So I think that those business things, those hardware things have enabled us to take things more seriously. And I think we're at a point now where we're realizing, having more interesting characters, telling stories about fresh protagonists that we haven't seen before is a good thing. And there's an audience for this, and there's maybe a big audience for doing these things. And it's weird to think that every big budget video game now has to take story seriously. And, even if the interactive narrative is not necessarily clever, there's characters and writing, and they're going to bring in famous actors to act the parts and stuff, and that's everywhere. And it's and to some extent in those cases it's like story as a wrapper, and obviously the more interesting things to me are those where the story is at the heart of it. But kind of as a baseline, from starting out in the industry, where the first game I worked on in the industry was Serious Sam. It wasn't really a story in Serious Sam. It was like there's cool monsters that you need to blow up, and we have this protagonist, and there were like 5 cutscenes in that game that explained that the universe was going to be destroyed or something. I don't know, but it didn't care, and you were able to put that game out there and no one cared. Whereas now we understand that like stories are how we contextualize things and relate to things. So it's cool that baseline has kind of gone up. I think we still, there are still some things we wrestle with. I cry almost every day thinking about the mobile market now. Like, the iPhone is still the most ubiquitous video game platform we have. But right now, today, you can't talk about politics or sex or anything above a PG-13. You can no longer ask a premium price for a story game unless it's in Apple Arcade. Apple Arcade has to be a PG, family-friendly thing. So suddenly, I was so excited when Her Story was a big hit on the iPhone, and like all of the interesting coverage. So, broadsheet newspapers like Le Monde, Libération in France did these big articles about the game. Just this general interest from the wider world came from the fact that it was on a phone that people could play. And we saw with like Telling Lies that we didn't have the support from Apple because the themes in it were not suitable. So we still have these things that are holding us back, where you know, we're still restricted in how we tell stories. Like, you know, on a phone, I can watch HBO or Netflix and see anything on screen, essentially, any piece of storytelling. But the second it moves over into the games section, into the interactive section, we lose all of these things. So I think that continues to be a challenge. You know, we still struggle with some of the business side. You know, the bigger games, there is an expectation that your game has to be 20, 30, 40, 50 hours long, that it needs to fill everybody's free time. Whereas, you know, a movie only needs to be 2 hours long. A book can be anywhere, you know, from 3 to 5 hours long. And personally, I love narratives where I can consume them fully in like a single sitting, because I think you can kind of give yourself over to it. Or, you know, the case of the book, you know, a few sessions. And I think there's something about the focus that brings that is really interesting. And I think we're continuing to push that idea that you can have shorter games, that you can have different shaped games, and we can have again, digital has really helped here. But, you know, it all feels positive just as we continue to push. There is obviously a fusion that happens at some point between traditional media and video games that everybody is trying to make happen. I've had countless meetings with TV and film people where their bosses want to make this happen, because their bosses go, we're losing money to social media, we're losing money to video games, what do we do? And it's easy to put Christopher Nolan's movie in Fortnite, but that isn't really solving the problem. So they desperately want to figure this thing out. And so they know that and they look at what happened to music, and they look at what happened to ebooks. And so they know that whatever the mainstream storytelling medium is, that at some point this is going to become more interactive. It kind of feels inevitable, and they have no idea what it looks like. So they're pushing that from the movie side, and you get, you know, repeated examples where you will usually take somebody that has a track record in linear media and give them some tools, whether that is Steven Soderbergh making Mosaic on HBO, or whether it's Bandersnatch on Netflix. And usually, you know, these things are not necessarily as sophisticated as some of the work that's being done over on the interactive narrative or interactive fiction side. And then on the game side, you know, you have people that are trying to push narrative to the forefront and trying to explore things. And, you know, it's at some point, something will happen. We're not quite sure yet what it looks like, and it will inevitably be a business or a hardware thing that defines it, I think. Like, you know, the biggest frustration I've had within the industry has always been every time there is a new generation of video game consoles, you want them to be as cheap and as available as the DVD player became, right? I think for me, like, you think of DVDs and they were this extreme expensive cinephile thing. At some point they became so cheap you could put them on magazines, and then everybody had them, and then they went away and streaming happened. And every time the investors look at it, and at the last minute they go, well, the early adopters of this games console are going to be teenage boys who want to play Call of Duty and Halo. So we're going to make another expensive shooty box. So, you know, that kind of cycle has always been frustrating. But it feels like smart televisions, phone technology, there is this general convergence that, you know, will enable us to inject interesting ideas into kind of where people are consuming their stories. So I think that's all positive.